In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural pickle material in Blender. If you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, then you can do that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs to purchase more of my materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. Again, all the links are in the description. And then also before we start, I want to thank Sketchfab for sponsoring this video. Sketchfab is a 3D model marketplace where you can buy, sell, and even upload your own 3D models and preview them in your browser. You can also purchase models and assets from Sketchfab's huge 3D model store. Use the model inspector to preview the wireframe, matcap, textures, and more before you purchase. Check out Sketchfab with the link in the description. Alright, so let me just go over the 3D setup real quick. So I just modeled a very basic pickle material, and I just kind of like added a cylinder and then extruded it out, and then just kind of extruded it and scaled it down and filled some faces in there. And then also I wanted to preview the material on a sphere because I like previewing procedural materials on spheres. So I added an icosphere and subdivided it so it's nice and smooth, and then I just shaded these objects smooth. And then I also added a camera and pointed that right at the objects. And then for the lighting, I also added this plane right here. So this is just a plane with a subdivision surface modifier so that it is circular. And then on this plane, I gave it an emission material with a strength of 50 just to get some nice bright lighting on the objects. And then also to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections on the objects, I added in this Christmas Photo Studio 4 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I just downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version, so link is in the description if you'd like to download it. So in the world, if you just add a new world, you can click on the color right here, just click on the yellow dot, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. Now I am going to be using the displacements in the node editor to make the little bumps on the pickles kind of pop out. So if you want to use the displacements like I'll be doing in this tutorial, then you will need to be using the cycles render engine. So make sure you're using cycles. And then I'm also going to be using the adaptive displacement. So if you want to use the adaptive displacement, you can set this to experimental here on the feature set, and this is right over here on the render properties. So then what I did is just selected these objects, and I went right over here to the modifier properties, and right here I gave them a subdivision surface modifier, and then I check marked the adaptive subdivision, and this way it's going to subdivide the mesh more where it's closer up and give it more detail, and so the displacement will have more geometry to work with. But then where it's farther away, it'll have less detail. And I also set the dicing scale to 5. And then for this object right here, this object is pretty subdivided, so I didn't add any adaptive displacements. So I have the 3D view right here, and then I also have the shader editor right here. So I can just click on new to add a new material, and I can just rename this procedural pickle. Now we need to tell the material to use the displacements. So if you click right over here on the material properties, I'm going to open up the settings tab right here, and then I'm going to open up the surface tab. And then right here on the displacement, I want to change this to displacement and bump. And this is going to tell the material that it can use the displacements. And again, this will only work if you're using the cycles render engine. So I can now make this smaller, and let's create the material. One last thing though, before I start with the material, I'm going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have that enabled, you can just click on edit and open up the preferences, and then right over there on the add-ons tab, you can search for Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So when I was looking at reference images to create this pickle material, it seemed like all of the pickles had kind of a gradient with the colors, because some side of the pickles were a bit more yellowish and a bit brighter, but then other parts were a bit more green and a bit darker. So let's add that gradient. So I'm going to start off by pressing Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the gradient texture, and let's just drop it here. And then I also want to click and drag and drop this material onto this other object right here. Now we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, so with the Node Wrangler add-on now turned on, I can Control Shift and then select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object so you can see what it's doing. So you can see we just have a very basic gradient. gradient. Now I want to change the colors of this gradient texture to make it look more like a pickle. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to click on the color ramp, and I'm just going to drop it right here in this wire. So now we can change these colors here in the color ramp, and that'll change the colors of the gradient. So I'm going to take the white tab and I'm going to drag it out a little bit, and then this one I want to click on the color down here, and I'm going to make this kind of a yellowish color. And if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go over to the hex value and you can punch in a hex value of CCBC2D. So that's the exact yellow color that I'm going to be using. And then right here on the color ramp, I can hold down the control key and click, and that is going to add another tab. And then I'm going to drag this tab to about here, and I want to make this one a green color. So I'm going to click on the color right here, and I'm going to make this kind of a green color, not super green, and a little bit desaturated and a bit darker. And the hex value that I'm using for this color is going to be 5C6811. And then I want to make the dark color just a little bit stronger, so I'm going to just drag this out just a little bit. So now you can see we have a nice gradient here on the pickle, and I think I will just move this green one over just a little. So I want to organize my nodes very well just so that it's easy for you to understand all the nodes and what they do. So I'm going to select the color ramp and then shift select the gradient. I can then press Ctrl J, and Ctrl J is going to add a frame. Totally optional, you don't need to add the frames if you don't want to, they're just to organize the nodes. But then I can click on the frame and I can press F2 to rename this, and I'm just going to rename this to gradient. And then I can take the color and I'm going to plug that into the base color, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I want to create those little dots which are on the pickle, because pickles usually have some little dark dots. So to do this, I'm going to bring the gradient texture up just a little bit, and then I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and to create the dots, I can search for a Voronoi texture, and let's drop the Voronoi down here. And then again, to preview it, I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi. Now you can see that there's a little bit of stretching, and I also want to just ensure that the Voronoi texture is placed on the object very evenly. So with the Voronoi texture selected, I can just press Control T, and Control T is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and again, that's using the feature from the Node Wrangler. Now I don't need the mapping. The mapping is just used to change the location, rotation, and scale of the texture, but I can just click on the mapping and press X to delete it. I want to use the object coordinates, so let's take the object and I'm going to put that into the vector. And this way, now you can see that the Voronoi texture is placed on the objects more evenly. Now right here on this F1, I want to click on this, and I want to change this instead to smooth F1. And this way, now you can see that there isn't those sharp areas and it's more smooth around the dots. Now I don't want it to be super smooth, I want it to be a bit less smooth. So I'm going to turn this smoothness value to just like a 0.6. I can also drag this out so you can read the entire thing. And then I also want to have more dots, so I'm going to take the scale and I'm going to turn this up to like a 9.5 just so that there are more dots. And you might need to play around with the scale value depending on the size of your object. Alright, now if you zoom in here, you can see the dots are very smooth and round, and I want them to be a little bit random and a little bit more natural and organic. So to do this, I'm going to put a noise texture in here to distort the placement of the Voronoi. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's click on this noise texture, and I'm just going to drop this right here. So now the noise texture is changing the placement of the Voronoi. Now I don't want to distort it this much because that is super distorted. So I'm going to bring the noise texture down, and then I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a mix RGB. Let's just drop the mix RGB right in here between these two textures. Then I can take the object and I'm going to put the object into color 1 of the mix. And then the noise texture is going to go into color 2. So now I can drag the factor, and if I turn it all the way down to 0, it's not using the noise at all. But if I turn it up all the way to 1, it's using the noise completely. And then also you can see that this moves the texture around a lot. So to make this so it doesn't move it around as much, I'm going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to go down here and change this to linear light. So now that that has changed to linear light, you can see that the texture isn't being moved around quite as much, and you can kind of see what it's doing better. And I actually got this tip from a YouTube comment in one of my videos. So thank you to whoever let me know about this linear light. That's really awesome that it's not going to move the texture around. Now I don't want it to be very distorted distorted because I mostly just want it to be those circular dots. So let's take the factor value and I'm going to turn this to a 0.05, and that way it is very subtle, but it is going to distort those dots a little bit and kind of give them some random shapes. Now I want to change the colors to make it look more like a pickle. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go to the search and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on this color ramp and I can just drop it right in here in this wire after the Voronoi texture, and then make sure you Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So I'm going to click on the white tab and I'm going to drag this white tab over because I want it to be more contrasty, and that way you're just able to see those dots in some places, because if I drag this over you're able to see much more dark areas, but I just want to be able to see the dots in some areas, so I'm going to bring this over to about halfway. And then right now it is white, but I want to make it a pickle color, so let's take the white tab right here and I'm going to change this to kind of a green color, and then I'm going to make it darker, so kind of a dark green and not super saturated, so kind of a grayish greenish color. And the hex value that I'll be using for this color is going to be 555 B15. So that is the color that I'll be using. And then I want to organize the nodes very well. So I'm going to press B for the box select. I'm just going to box select all of these 4 nodes here. And then again, I can press Control J and that will join them together into a frame. And I can drag the texture coordinate up. We'll be using this for some other textures. And then I can kind of make this a bit smaller, kind of bring it up here. And then if you select the frame, you can press F2 to rename it. And I'm going to rename it to dots. So I can now hold down the Control and Shift key and select these different color ramps. So I want to mix them together because I want the pickle to have the gradient, but then I also want to mix it with the dots. So I'm going to select the color ramp, hold down the Shift key and select the other color ramp. So they're both selected. I can now press Control 0, again that's using the feature from the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add this Mix RGB. So I can just click on this to open it up and kind of bring it up here. And then I'm going to Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So now you can see that we are just blending between the 2 color ramps. Now I want to change the factor to like a 0.7, and that way you can see those dots a little bit better. So now we have the gradients and the dots. So now just make sure that the color is going into the base color of the principled BSDF. And I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now this pickle color isn't very random. I want to give it more random noise to make it more organic and random and change up the variation of the colors a little bit. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's click on the noise texture and I'm just going to drop it right here. So right after this gradient, I can just bring it right there. Now I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And I again want to use the object coordinates so that it's placed on the object more evenly. So I'm going to take the object from the texture coordinate and I'm going to plug that into the vector of the noise texture. And then I also want to add a reroute in here because you can see that this wire is overlapping. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and then right click and drag with my mouse and just drag over the wire and then let go. And that is going to add a reroute, and then I can just click and drag and drop the reroute here. All right, so now I want to change the noise texture a little bit. So I'm going to turn the scale down to like a 4 so that the scale is a bit smaller, but then I do want to have lots of detail. So let's turn the detail all the way up to the max, which is 15. All right, so we now have this noise texture here, but I want to plug this into the base color. So I'm going to click on this Mix RGB right here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to drop it right here after the first Mix RGB. And I can bring these nodes back. All right, so I now want to add the noise texture into this Mix RGB here. So let's take the factor and I'm going to put that into the factor value of the mix. And then I can Control Shift and select this to preview it. And then I want this mix here to be going into color 1. So now I can take color 2 and I'm just going to set this to fully black. And you can now see that we have a really cool color map there for the pickle, and you can see the pickle has a bunch of noise there, so that's looking really cool. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now this pickle material is not very shiny, and pickles are usually very wet and reflective, so I'm going to take the roughness value and I'm going to turn that way down. And you can see now the pickle is more shiny. But instead instead of just changing the roughness value right here, I want to add in a texture so that some parts are a bit more rough and then other parts are a bit more shiny. So I'm going to take this color ramp here from the dots. I'm going to take the color and I'm going to plug that into the roughness. Now I want to have more control over this because you can see it looks very shiny and it's reflecting the HDRI. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and we're just going to stick the color ramp in between this color ramp and the roughness. So I can now change the colors, and that'll change how rough it is. So if I make the colors lighter, it's going to be more rough. So I can click on the black tab, and I can turn this color up, and you can see as I turn it up, it's going to be more rough. And the hex value that I'll be using is a hex value of 595959. So by making it this gray color, you can see that it is pretty shiny, but it's not super shiny. So this is starting to look like a pickle material, but you can see that it's very smooth and it's not really bumpy. And so I want to add some data into the normal to give it some bump. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. I'm going to click on the noise texture, and I can just drop it right here. Actually, I'll bring it down a little bit. And I want to use this noise texture just to give a little bit of bump all over the pickle to make it look more organic and natural. So let's take the object from the texture coordinate, and I'm going to plug that into the vector. And then again, you can see this is overlapping. This wire here is overlapping, so I want to add a reroute. So hold down the Shift key, right click and drag over the wire and let go. That'll add the reroute, and then I can press G to grab or just click and drag and drop the reroute right down there. And then I want to Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So I want to turn the scale up quite a bit, so I'm going to turn the scale up to a value of 15. And then I also want to add lots of detail, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15 as well. So there's lots of detail in there. So I now want to plug this noise texture into the normal. So take the factor, pull out a wire, and we're going to put that into the normal. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see there's some really weird shading issues, and that's because this is black and white data. It is a factor value, but then this is normal data. You can see it is a purple dot. So I need to convert the black and white data into normal data so the principled shader can actually use it. So to do this, we're going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search. I'm going to search for a bump node, and we're going to put the bump node right in here between the noise texture and the principled. Now we want to take the factor value and we actually want to put it into the height, and this way it's going to convert it to normal data. So you can see the pickle looks very bumpy. Now it is way too bumpy right now, and I want to make it much less bumpy. So you can click on the strength value, and I'm going to turn this way down to like a 0.13. And that way now if you zoom in here, there is definitely some bump, but it's much less strong. Now where those little dots are on the pickle, I want that to be bumping out. So we also are going to take this color ramp here from the dots, and we're also going to plug that into the normal. So let's click on the bump node, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's just drop it here. So I can take the normal and I can plug that into the normal right there. And this way we can mix multiple bump maps together. So I can take this color ramp right here from the dots, and I'm going to take the color and I'm going to put that into the height value of the bump. And then if I turn the strength value up on the bump, you can see those dots look like they're going in. But instead of them going in, I want them to pop out. So I can click on the invert button, and now those dots look like they're popping out. And then they are way too strong, so I'm just going to turn the strength value to like 0.1 here on this bump so that they're more subtle. Now I know that does look very, very subtle, but we're also going to be putting the dots into the displacement to actually pop out the mesh. Now if you don't want to use the displacement, you could turn the strength value up to make those dots look like they're popping out more, but I'm going to leave the strength value at just like a 0.1. Alright, so this is really starting to look like a pickle material, but I do want to give it some bump. So what I'm going to do is take this distance from the Voronoi texture. I'm going to take the distance and I'm going to drag this all the way over. You can kind of push and drag this over, and I'm going to stick this into the displacement on the material output. Now you can see it is displacing the mesh, but just like with these bump nodes, I want to add a node in here to convert this black and white data into displacement data. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node, and I'm going to drop the displacement node right here in this wire, and then I can just drag it down, and I'm going to stick it right here under the principled shader. Now you can see that something is still wrong. It's just kind of moving the pickle over, and that is because I need to take this wire and I'm going to put it up to the height value. So take the distance from the Voronoi texture and put that into the height value of the displacement. So now you can see it's working, but it's way too strong. So I'm going to turn the mid-level to 0. I do think it looks better if the mid-level is turned to 0. And then I can turn the scale way down to just like a 0.1. So now you can see that's much less strong. Now it's still not looking like a pickle. That does look pretty cool. That is a pretty cool texture there, but it's not looking like a pickle because it's not bumpy in the areas where I want. I want it to mostly be smooth, but just be bumpy in some areas. So to do this, I can add a color ramp and then I can sharpen up the values. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to stick the color ramp right here before the displacement node. And I'm just going to bring the color ramp right down here. And then if you want to, you can select both of these nodes here, and then you can press Control J, and that is going to add the frame here. And then I can press F2 with the frame selected, and I'm going to rename this to displacement. Alright, so now I can change the color ramp values. So I'm first going to take the black tab and I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this a bit more of a gray color. And the hex value that I'll be using for this gray color is going to be 9 6 times. Alright, so now you can see it's less strong because we've turned the color up. So you can see as I turn the color up, it's going to make the displacement less strong. Now I can also click on this white tab, and I'm going to drag the white tab over because I want it to be more contrasty. So you can see as I drag this over, now it is more contrasty because we are crushing these two values. So it's more contrasty. So now those dots are just in some places here and there, and that is exactly what I want. Now the dots are going back in. So if I take this color and make it darker, it's going to flip that, so then the bumps are going to be going out instead of going back in. So I can click on the white tab, click on the color here, and I can make this darker, and then it's going to flip it. So now as I make this darker, now you can see that those dots are popping out instead. And the hex value that I'll be using for this darker color is going to be 717171. And I'm going to kind of bring it over a little bit, just kind of stick it about there, kind of in the center. Alright, so this is really looking like a pickle material. There is just one more thing that I want to do though to this material. I want to give this material some subsurface scattering, and that way it's going to allow a little bit of light to go through the pickle material. So if I go right over here to the subsurface on the principled, I can turn the subsurface up, and you can see even if I just turn it up a little bit, it's going to allow light to go through. Now right here you can see there is a subsurface color. I'm going to click on this, and I want to make this a yellow color. And if you'd like to use the same subsurface scattering color, you can go right here to the subsurface color and go to the hex value, and I'm going to be using a value of E6 B000. So it's pretty much a yellow color, a little bit darker, and then it's a little bit more towards the orange. So you can see now that's allowing a lot of light to go through, and it does make it look much more like food. Now the subsurface scattering is way too strong, so I can turn the subsurface scattering to a much smaller number, and now you can see it's not quite as strong. But there is one thing that I don't like about this. If I zoom in here, you can see that those little dots are looking kind of red. And so what I want to do is make there be less subsurface scattering where the dots are, but then the rest of the pickle is going to have a little bit more subsurface scattering. So to do this, I can use the dots texture. So I'm going to take the color right here from the dots, and I'm going to plug that into the subsurface. So the subsurface right here on the principled shader. And then again, just like many of these other values, I want to have more control over it. So I'm actually going to take this color ramp right here from the roughness, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. And I'm going to stick it right in here, right before the subsurface. And you can kind of drag this out, kind of bring these nodes out of the way. So I can now change the colors here, and that is going to change where the subsurface is. So if the color is white, there's going to be lots of subsurface scattering, but if the color is black, there isn't going to be any subsurface scattering. So I can Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it just to see what it's doing. And I'm going to click on this tab, and I'm going to make this tab fully black because I don't want there to be any subsurface scattering where the dots are. And I'm also going to drag this out just a little bit to make the dots a bit more contrasty. And then I can drag this out and kind of crush those values to make this more contrasty as well. And I'm going to bring this to about here, so kind of in the middle, and you can see the position values that I'm using right here. So as I said, if the colors are lighter, there's going to be more subsurface scattering, but I don't want to have very much subsurface scattering, because if I Control Shift and select the principled shader, you can see that is way too much. It looks very yellow. So I'm going to click on this white tab and I'm going to make it much darker. So as I make it darker, there's going to be less subsurface scattering. And I do want it to be pretty subtle, but I will make that a little bit brighter. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using, you can go to the hex and you can punch in 7E, 7E, 7E. So that is the lighter color that I'm going to be using for the subsurface here on this color ramp. So now if you look closely, you can see there is a little bit of subsurface scattering, but it is pretty subtle. And also where there's dots are, there isn't really any subsurface scattering. So that is the procedural pickle material. So I'll just give this a final render. So I hope you enjoyed this Blender tutorial, and thank you so much for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel, as well as purchase this procedural material, then you can purchase the material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs to purchase more of my materials, and that's also a great way to help support me and this channel. And if you'd like to learn how to create more procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. Links are in the description. But I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.